He went to prison, and his family was butchered. His son, his father, his consigliere vanished. The men he trusted most switched sides. When Vito Rizzuto walked out of that American cell in 2012, he wasn't looking for peace. He had a list. The man they thought wouldn't come back. The 5th of October, 2012, at 9:30 in the evening. Vito Rizzuto walked out of FCI Florence, a federal correctional institution in Colorado, after serving roughly 6 years of a 10-year sentence for conspiracy to commit murder. He was 66 years old. He was immediately deported not to a country of his choosing, but to Canada, the country he had spent his entire adult life building into the most sophisticated organized crime network north of New York. He was driven to Toronto first, then made his way to Montreal. No fanfare, no press conference, no visible security detail that the public could see. But behind the scenes, the picture was different. Sources who spoke to Canadian journalists in the weeks after his return described what Rizzuto's situation actually looked like on the ground: a well-guarded apartment, an armored vehicle, a man who understood precisely how dangerous the city he was returning to had become, and who was making clear, through the visible precautions he took, that he intended to be difficult to kill. The armored car was not a security measure in any civilian sense. It was a statement, delivered without words, to everyone in Montreal who was watching and calculating. Vito Rizzuto was back. He knew what had happened while he was gone, and anyone who had participated in what had happened while he was gone now had to decide what to do about the fact that he was home. The press had written him off. That was the consensus among Canadian journalists and organized crime analysts who had watched what happened to the Rizzuto family while Vito sat in a Colorado cell. His son was dead. His father was dead. His consigliere, Paolo Renda, had vanished from the face of the earth in May 2010, gone so completely that his body has never been found. A disappearance that in the organized crime world communicates something specific and terrible about what happened to him and about the men who had the power to make it happen. The entire senior leadership of the organization had been swept up in Project Colisée in 2006, arrested in a single coordinated morning that left the Rizzuto structure without its command tier. The men who had stayed free had been picked off by the coalition that had used Vito's absence to consolidate its own power. By October 2012, there were serious analysts who argued that the Rizzuto family was finished, that the damage to the organization was simply too comprehensive to survive, that a man in his mid-60s, who had spent 6 years in an American prison, who was reportedly already dealing with health problems that would eventually kill him, would make the rational choice to step away and spend whatever time he had left in something approaching peace. The argument was not unreasonable. The evidence for it was substantial. The conclusion drawn from it turned out to be completely wrong. What those analysts missed, what the press missed, what the men who had gambled on Vito's permanent absence had catastrophically miscalculated was the specific nature of what had been taken from him. This was not simply an organizational setback. His son had been shot 6 times. His father had been killed by a sniper's bullet in his own home. His sister's husband had been made to disappear. The men who had done these things, or sanctioned them, or benefited from them, were still alive. Some of them were operating in Montreal, in the same neighborhoods, using the same contacts, occupying positions in the criminal landscape that the Rizzuto family's weakness had opened to them. The idea that Vito Rizzuto, a man who had spent 30 years in a world where the response to any insult was violence, where the answer to betrayal was death, where the entire system of authority rested on the credibility of the threat of consequence, would simply accept that and go quietly, is an idea that only makes sense to people who have never understood what a mafia boss actually is. He had 1 month from his return to his first kill. That should have surprised no one. The empire that was built and what it cost to build it. To understand what had been taken from Vito Rizzuto while he was imprisoned, you have to understand what he had built in the decades before his arrest. Because the men who betrayed him weren't betraying a simple criminal. They were betraying the most sophisticated criminal network in Canadian history, and the man who had spent 30 years making it run. Vito Rizzuto was born in February 1946 in Cattolica, Ercole, in the Sicilian province of Agrigento. He immigrated to Montreal with his family in 1954, on his 8th birthday, docking at Pier 21 in Halifax, alongside thousands of other post-war Italian families seeking a new life in the north. His father, Niccolo, had preceded the rest of the family to Canada, the same pattern, the same story, that thousands of Italian immigrant families followed in the 1950s. The Rizzutos settled in Montreal's Italian community in Saint-Léonard, and from the beginning, the family's trajectory in the new world was shaped by its connections to the old one. Niccolo Rizzuto was connected. He was a member of the Sicilian faction within Montreal's Italian criminal landscape, which, in the early 1970s, meant operating as a subordinate element within the broader structure controlled by the Cotroni family, a Calabrian organization that had run Montreal's underworld for decades and maintained its purge authority through a combination of tradition, violence, and the specific institutional relationship with New York's Bonanno family that gave the Cotroni arrangement its international legitimacy. That arrangement came apart in the 1970s when the Sicilian faction decided it was no longer interested in subordination. What followed was one of the most documented mob wars in Canadian history. Paolo Violi, the Cotroni captain who ran day-to-day operations in Montreal, was eliminated. His brothers were eliminated. By the time the war was over, in the early 1980s, the Rizzuto family had assumed control of Montreal's organized crime landscape, and Vito, who had grown up watching his father operate and had been developing his own criminal credentials through the decade, was positioned to inherit a throne that the family had just finished building. In 1981, Vito cemented his status in the international Mafia hierarchy through an act of violence that would define his legacy decades later. Three captains of New York's Bonanno family, Philip Giacconi, Alphonse Indelicato, and Dominic Trinchera, had been plotting to overthrow the Bonanno boss, Rusty Rastelli. They were lured to a meeting at a restaurant in Brooklyn. They walked in and never walked out. Vito Rizzuto was there, one of a four-man hit squad. He emerged from hiding with a shotgun and, according to the testimony that would eventually undo him, was the first to start shooting. It was proof of concept, proof that Vito was not simply inheriting his father's network, but was himself capable of the kind of decisive, high-stakes violence that the Mafia's internal hierarchy respected above everything else. In the 3 decades that followed, Vito built something extraordinary. Montreal became the hub of an international criminal network that reached across North America, into South America, and across the Atlantic to Sicily and the European criminal markets. He was fluent in English, Italian, French, and Spanish, a linguistic range that made him uniquely capable of brokering between the various criminal organizations that wanted access to what Montreal's geography and criminal infrastructure offered. He dealt with the Hells Angels, with the West End Gang, with South American cocaine cartels, with the Italian Mafia's European operations. He was, in the assessment of investigators and organized crime analysts who studied him for decades, the most capable organized crime boss Canada had ever produced. Antonio Nicaso, the foremost academic authority on the Italian Mafia in North America, called Niccolo Rizzuto the boss of the Mafia in Canada. What Vito became was something more than that, a statesman in the criminal world, a man whose ability to make peace between competing factions generated more revenue than any individual criminal operation. When investigators eventually testified about his role in the Montreal underworld, the picture they painted was not of a violent boss running day-to-day criminal operations, but of an executive who operated above that level, who managed relationships, resolved disputes, and held the entire structure together through the specific combination of reputation, intelligence, and the ever-present knowledge that he could order violence when diplomacy failed. Then the informants came for him. In 2004, Joseph Massino, the Bonanno boss, who had ordered the 1,981 Brooklyn killings and who was now facing life imprisonment himself, made the decision to cooperate with federal prosecutors. The information he provided was comprehensive and devastating. Vito Rizzuto was named as one of the shooters in the 1981 triple murder. A Brooklyn grand jury indicted him. In 2006, he was extradited to the United States to face the charge. On the 4th of May, 2007, he stood in front of an American judge and pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, acknowledging his presence at the 1,981 killings while carefully limiting what he admitted to. The sentence was 10 years, the fine was $250,000, and the consequences for Montreal, beginning immediately, were catastrophic. The years of blood. What happened while Vito was gone? Vito Rizzuto's arrest in 2004 and subsequent incarceration from 2007 onward created a power vacuum in Montreal's criminal landscape that ambitious men immediately moved to fill. What followed was not a single war, but a cascading series of power struggles, betrayals, and murders that consumed the Montreal underworld for 6 years and left the Rizzuto family's structure damaged in ways that no one, including, possibly, the men doing the damage, fully anticipated. The first major blow came in November 2006 with Project Colisée. For 4 years, the RCMP had conducted a surveillance operation of unprecedented scope, hidden cameras and microphones installed in the Consenza Social Club on Jarry Street, the social club that served as the Rizzuto family's operational headquarters, and in Bar Léanique in Laval. The footage captured everything: money being counted, decisions being made, the entire senior leadership of the Montreal Mafia conducting business in the specific locations where the RCMP had hidden the equipment that recorded it all. On the 22nd of November 2006, the results of that surveillance went public. 90 people arrested in coordinated raids. Niccolo Rizzuto, Paolo Renda, Rocco Solicito, Francesco Arcadi, Lorenzo Giordano, Francesco Del Balso, the entire command structure of the organization, taken down in a single morning. The Rizzuto family's institutional infrastructure was, in a matter of hours, effectively decapitated. What happened in the vacuum that followed was the story of what happens when the specific kind of authority that a powerful crime boss provides is suddenly absent. Montreal's organized crime landscape did not simply pause and wait for Vito's return. It reorganized around the opportunities his absence created. The key figure who took advantage of that reorganization was Reynald Desjardins. Desjardins was one of the most unusual figures in the Montreal Mafia's history, a French-Canadian who had risen to senior status in an organization defined by its Sicilian and Calabrian membership. He was Vito's former right-hand man. He had been involved in drug trafficking operations with the Rizzuto family going back decades, including a 1,987 operation that moved 17 tons of Turkish hashish through Newfoundland fishing boats. He knew the organization from the inside as well as any living person, and he had his own ambitions. When Vito went to prison, Desjardins began building towards something that the Rizzuto family would not have allowed had Vito been present and in control. The second key figure was Salvatore Montagna. Born in Montreal in 1971 and raised in Castellammare del Golfo in Sicily, Montagna had immigrated to the United States as a teenager, settled in the Bronx, and risen through the Bonanno family's hierarchy to become, by the mid-2000s, the family's acting boss. The FBI called him the Bambino Boss. He had achieved the acting leadership of a New York crime family in his mid-30s. When he was deported from the United States to Canada in 2009, he arrived in Montreal with the specific intention of taking advantage of the vacuum that Vito's imprisonment had created. He saw a throne. He moved toward it. The 28th of December, 2009, Nick Rizzuto Jr., 42 years old, Vito's eldest son, and the face of the organization on the street, was shot 6 times and killed near his car in the Montreal borough of Notre-Dame-de-Grâce. The killing announced, in the clearest possible language, that the rules had changed. Vito was in a Colorado prison cell when his son's body was found. He could do nothing. The 20th of May, 2010, Paolo Renda, the family's consigliere and the husband of Vito's sister, disappeared. He was 70 years old. His body has never been found. In the Mafia, a disappearance is sometimes a more powerful message than a visible murder. The absence of a body is an absence of certainty, an ongoing wound that never closes because there is no burial to mark the ending. June 2010, Agostino Contreras, who had been serving as acting boss in the wake of the senior leadership's arrests, was killed with his bodyguard in broad daylight. The interim structure was being dismantled. Then came the most significant single act of the entire war, the 10th of November 2010. Niccolo Rizzuto, 86 years old, the patriarch who had built the family, the man who had come to Canada and through cunning and violence established the Sicilian faction's dominance over Montreal's criminal landscape, was sitting in his mansion in Cartierville. A single shot fired through double-paned glass. He died instantly in his own home, in front of his wife. The old man killed in the one place where an 86-year-old was entitled to feel safe. Vito was still in Colorado. His son, his consigliere, his father, three of the most important people in his personal and criminal life, gone in less than a year. The coup attempt that had produced these killings was ultimately the work of the Desjardins-Montagne alliance, backed by elements of the Calabrian faction that had always resented Sicilian dominance of Montreal's organized crime landscape, but the alliance was unstable from the beginning. In 2011, Desjardins and Montagne had a falling out, reportedly over control of loan sharking and bookmaking, the kind of specific territorial dispute that criminal partnerships built on convenience rather than genuine trust tend to produce. In September 2011, Montagne's side allegedly attempted to have Desjardins assassinated. A gunman with an AK-47 sprayed Desjardins' SUV with 17 bullets as he was getting into the vehicle in Laval. Desjardins survived. He made a phone call from custody to one of the Arcueil brothers' men connected to Montagne and said, "I know it's you, and I won't miss you." He didn't miss. On the 24th of November 2011, Salvatore Montagne was found shot to death in Charlemagne, northeast of Montreal, his body on the shore of the L'Assomption River. Witnesses reported he had jumped into the river in an attempt to escape his killers. The coup had eaten itself. The alliance that had dismantled the Rizzuto family had turned its weapons on itself. Desjardins, who had already begun that turn, was eventually charged and convicted in connection with Montagne's murder, sentenced to 14 years in prison. For Vito Rizzuto, watching all of this from a federal cell in Colorado, the picture that was taking shape was specific and terrible. His son was dead. His father was dead. His consigliere was gone. The man who had orchestrated the attempt to take his throne was now also dead, killed by the very ally who had helped him attempt it. The organization was in disarray, and Vito was due to be released in October 2012. He had 1 year to wait. He used it to plan. There is one more element of the years between 2009 and 2012 that demands attention because it speaks directly to the specific nature of what Vito returned to, the role of Reynald Desjardins in everything that had happened. Desjardins was not simply an opportunist who had seen weakness and moved toward it. He was Vito's most trusted French-Canadian associate, a man who had been with the Rizzuto organization for decades, who had worked with Vito on drug trafficking operations that stretched from Newfoundland to Turkey, who had survived a 1,990 acquittal alongside Vito on hashish smuggling charges, and who had been described by one Montreal organized crime writer as the most influential non-Italian in the Montreal Mafia since the organization's early years. He was not a rival who had always been waiting to strike. He was a partner who had chosen, when the window appeared, to walk through it. That specific quality of the betrayal, the intimacy of it, the decades of shared criminal enterprise that preceded it, is what made the Desjardins dimension of the story the one that Vito felt most personally. It is also what made the systematic targeting of Desjardins' network in the revenge campaign something beyond ordinary retaliation. Each man connected to Desjardins who died sent a message not just about organizational consequence, but about the specific price of betrayal by someone who had been trusted. The message was calibrated to that intimacy. Every killing in Desjardins' network said, "Proximity to the man who betrayed me is proximity to death, and it does not matter that he is in prison. His network is the target. His connections are the target. Everything he built with the power he took from my family while my father was being shot in his kitchen is being dismantled, name by name, until nothing he touched remains." Desjardins was alive when Vito died. He remains the single greatest unresolved element of the revenge campaign that Vito conducted, the man whose actions set everything in motion, who survived long enough to go to prison, who was himself targeted by a subsequent assassination attempt in 2015, organized by Maurice Boucher of the Hells Angels Nomads, who received a 14-year sentence for his role in Montagne's death. Whether Vito would have eventually reached him directly, given more time, is a question the cancer answered before the list could. October 2012, the cat comes home. A veteran mobster named Juan Ramon Fernandez, a man who had been connected to the Rizzuto organization for decades, whose own fate would eventually be sealed by those connections, was recorded on Italian court wiretaps, making a specific observation about what had happened in Montreal while Vito was imprisoned. The recording was made in a context that Fernandez had not anticipated. Italian prosecutors were conducting their own investigation, and Fernandez's phone calls were being captured and would eventually be played in a Palermo courtroom. In one of those calls, Fernandez made the observation that became famous in organized crime circles afterward. "It's like the saying goes," he said, "when the cat's away, the mice will play. But mice can only dance for a while because they're small." The warning embedded in that observation was understood by everyone who heard it, and it was understood in the specific way that warnings function in the Mafia, not as a threat that needed to be stated explicitly, but as a description of the reality that the current situation had produced. Vito Rizzuto had come home. The dancing was over. What the days and weeks immediately after his return looked like inside the organization was described by intelligence sources who spoke to journalists covering the Montreal underworld at the time. Vito summoned men. Some came, some did not. The ones who refused the summons who blinked, who calculated that the Rizzuto return was not yet strong enough to demand the kind of visible realignment that accepting the summons would represent, placed themselves on the list by their absence as clearly as if they had, signed their names to it. This was the test of loyalty that a returning boss applied, and Vito applied it with the patience of a man who understood that what he was building toward required getting the intelligence correct before the actions began. He also, according to sources familiar with the period, made trips south to Cuba, to other locations where conversations could be had outside the surveillance environment that Montreal represented. These were strategic conversations, the kind where plans could be laid without the specific risk that Canadian or American law enforcement would be recording them. The organization was being rebuilt from the top, contact by contact, conversation by conversation, loyalty test by loyalty test, and in parallel, the list was taking shape. The men who had aligned themselves with Montagna's faction, who had bet, while Vito was in prison, that the bet would pay off, were now in an impossible position. The bet had already failed. Montagna was dead. Desjardins was in custody. The coup had collapsed before Vito even got out. But the question of what Vito would do about the men who had supported the coup remained open and terrifying. Some of them went into hiding the armored cars and bulletproof vests that sources described observing among Montreal's underworld figures in the weeks after Vito's return were not expressions of general caution. They were the physical symptoms of specific fear. Men who knew they were on the list were trying to make themselves expensive to kill. The first kill, Joe DiMaolo. The 5th of November, 2012, a quiet Sunday night in Blainville, a suburban municipality north of Montreal. Joseph Smiling Joe DiMaolo, 72 years old, was arriving at his home. He was one of the most respected figures in Montreal's organized crime landscape, a man who had been part of the city's underworld since the 1970s, a senior figure in the Calabrian faction, connected to both the Cotroni family and, through his brother-in-law, Reynald Desjardins, to the Rizzuto family itself. He was well liked. He had a reputation as a diplomat, a man who could manage relationships between factions and find the compromises that kept the peace. In the language of organized crime, he was a mediator. He was also a man who had switched sides when Vito went to prison, who had aligned himself, or at least not aligned himself against, the coalition that had killed Vito's son and Vito's father and made Vito's consigliere disappear from the face of the earth. A hitman was waiting outside his home. DiMaolo was shot to death in his own driveway. The message was delivered with a specific timing that made it unmistakable to anyone who understood how the Rizzuto organization communicated. The 5th of November, 2012, exactly 5 days from the anniversary of Niccolo Rizzuto's murder on the 10th of November, 2010. November 10th was a date with specific significance now, and the proximity of DiMaolo's death to it was not accidental. It was the first indication of what November 10th was going to mean going forward. A police officer told the Star at the time, "It's a clear message that there is no peace. There is no conciliation. It's a war. Kill or be killed." DiMaolo's funeral told its own story. Mob funerals in Montreal had always been attended by a specific cast of characters, the who's who of organized crime, paying their respects. The attendance itself communicating something about the deceased's standing and the network of relationships he had maintained in life. Di Maulo's funeral was lightly attended by those standards. The men who knew what his death meant stayed away. They were already beginning to calculate their own exposure. Pierre de Champlain, the former RCMP intelligence analyst who had studied the Montreal Mafia for decades, identified the hit on Di Maulo as a declaration. "They killed a legendary boss of the Calabrian faction of Montreal," he said. With his death, the Montreal Mafia thus lost its mediator. The man who could have negotiated between Vito and his enemies was now dead. The time for negotiation was over. The significance of Di Maulo's death extended beyond the loss of a single man. Di Maulo had been the connective tissue between the Calabrian and Sicilian factions of Montreal's organized crime landscape, a man who was not himself Calabrian, but whose marriage to Desjardins' sister and his decades of landscape. Relationships in both communities had given him a unique ability to broker between groups that historically distrusted each other. His presence had provided a specific kind of institutional glue that Montreal's underworld depended on, even if most of its members would never have articulated it in those terms. With Di Maulo dead, the mediating function he had served disappeared. The different factions were left to interact without the buffer that his relationships had provided. For Vito, that was partly the point. A mediator who had sided against him was not just a traitor to be punished, he was a structural element of the opposition that needed to be removed. Eliminating Di Maulo didn't just settle a personal debt, it destroyed the coalition's internal diplomacy. It left the men who remained on the list without the figure most capable of organizing them into a coherent response. It was not simply murder, it was organizational surgery, conducted with the specific knowledge of what each target's death would mean for the structure of the opposition. The police officer who described the killing as a declaration, "No peace, no conciliation, kill or be killed," was accurate. But the declaration was also a demonstration of organizational capacity. Vito Rizzuto had been home for 1 month. He had an armored car and a guarded apartment and lung cancer, and he had already demonstrated that the Montreal underworld was going to resume operating on his terms. Not because he asked it to, because the body in Blainville's driveway said so. The list and the method. What Vito Rizzuto conducted between October 2012 and his death in December 2013 was not a war in the conventional sense. Wars involve two sides with roughly comparable capacity to inflict damage on each other, two forces in active conflict, with neither side certain of the outcome. What Vito conducted was a purge, systematic, sequential, methodical, aimed at a specific list of men who had either directly participated in the attacks on his family, aligned themselves with the men who had, or benefited from the family's weakness in ways that the organization could not absorb without conceding the authority that was the source of its power. The method that emerged from that purge was instructive about how Vito operated and what his organizational philosophy was. Each killing was connected to a specific grievance, not random, not opportunistic, not the product of general anger about what had happened, but calculated to address a particular debt in a particular sequence. Each one was timed with a deliberateness that communicated something specific to the people still alive, and each one sent a message to everyone who hadn't yet been reached about the precision of the operation being conducted against them and the futility of resistance. November 2012 produced not only the Di Maulo killing, but also a series of other targeted deaths. Emilio Cordileone, 50 years old, was gunned down in a Huntsic on December 8th, shot near his parked car. Cordileone's killing was connected to his association with Giuseppe De Vito, a former Rizzuto family lieutenant who had sided against the family during the power struggle. Tony Gensale and Mohamed Awada were eliminated in the same period. Men whose alleged involvement in the 2008 abduction of a Rizzuto ally placed them on the list, regardless of their specific role in the more recent coup. 3 days before Christmas 2012, a gunman walked into the coffee shop connected to the incarcerated Giuseppe De Vito, killing one man and critically wounding another. De Vito himself was in prison. The message reached him there anyway. The hand that could reach you anywhere was making its presence known, even through prison walls, before the specific demonstration of that reach would arrive the following July. January 2013, Reynaud Desjardins' brother-in-law, Gaetan Gosselin, was murdered in front of his own home. Vincenzo Scuderi, an alleged associate of Giuseppe De Vito, was killed in the same period. The Desjardins network, the men connected to the man who had been Vito's trusted associate and had used that trust to help orchestrate the coup, was being dismantled one connection at a time. Even with Desjardins himself in custody and facing murder charges, his network remained exposed. Proximity to the betrayal was its own liability. The 8th of May, 2013. Juan Ramon Fernandez, the same man who had made the observation about mice dancing when the cat was away, the man who had named the dynamic with the specific confidence of someone who understood the Rizzuto organization from the inside, was found dead in Casteldacchia, near Palermo, Sicily. He had been deported from Canada to Sicily in 2012. He had believed, or perhaps hoped, that the European distance would provide some measure of protection from what was unfolding in Montreal. His body was found burned and riddled with more than 30 bullets. 30 bullets. The number is significant, not as a military necessity, a man can be killed with one, but as a statement. 30 bullets says something about what the target represented and what his death was designed to communicate to every other man on the list. It says, "We are not in a hurry, and we are not leaving any ambiguity about what this means." The prison kill, Giuseppe De Vito, the 8th of July, 2013. Giuseppe De Vito was 46 years old. He was serving a 15-year sentence at Donnacona Federal Penitentiary for conspiracy to import cocaine and gangsterism, charges a conviction from 2010 that had come in the aftermath of his own organizational maneuvering during the power struggle that the Rizzuto family's temporary weakness had enabled. He was, in the organized crime world's accounting, a traitor, a former Rizzuto family lieutenant who had aligned himself with Desjardins' faction, who had worked against the family during the coup attempt, and whose activities while Vito was imprisoned had placed him among the men on the list, regardless of the prison walls that now surrounded him. In the ordinary criminal calculation, prison provides a form of protection. The logistics of reaching someone inside a federal penitentiary are significantly more complicated than reaching them on the street. A man serving time is removed from the geography where most organized crime violence occurs, surrounded by corrections officers, subject to constant monitoring, living in an environment where the introduction of any weapon or lethal substance requires overcoming the institutional infrastructure of a federal correctional facility. The assumption embedded in most criminals' calculation is that prison, whatever its other deprivations, at least keeps you alive in the sense that the people who want to kill you on the outside cannot easily reach you on the inside. Giuseppe De Vito died in his cell at Donnacona of cyanide poisoning. Not shot, not stabbed in the yard in a conflict that could be attributed to prison gang dynamics. Poisoned in his cell inside a federal prison by someone who had managed to get cyanide to him in a form he consumed. The exact mechanism was never publicly established in full, how the cyanide reached him, who carried it in, what form it took when he encountered it. What was established was the outcome. De Vito was dead, and the manner of his death communicated something that no amount of public reporting could fully capture. A federal prison cell had not protected him from a man who had decided he needed to die. If you were on the list would find you wherever you were. That was the message, and it was received. The timing of De Vito's prison death, in the broader context of the campaign being conducted that year, also communicated something specific about the organizational capacity that Vito Rizzuto retained even after years of imprisonment and amid ongoing health challenges. Reaching a man inside a federal penitentiary with a substance that would kill him required contacts, logistics, trust, and the kind of operational patience that disorganized or weakened organizations cannot sustain. The Rizzuto organization, after the purge of 2012 and 2013, was demonstrating through each successive killing that it remained functional at exactly the level required to conduct operations that most criminal organizations would not have been capable of. The prison kill was the clearest proof of that. November 10th, 2013, the anniversary message. By the fall of 2013, the campaign had been running for a year. Multiple men were dead. Others had gone into hiding armored cars, bulletproof vests, the specific visible precautions that communicated fear to anyone watching. The message that Vito Rizzuto had returned and was settling accounts had been delivered in the most direct possible language. There was one more delivery to make, and it was the one that would demonstrate, with the greatest clarity, that what was being carried out was not simply revenge, but ceremony. Moreno Gallo, known as the Turkey in Montreal's underworld, had been a figure of some significance in the organization's history, a Calabrian who had survived the mob war that the Rizzutos had won in the 1970s and 1980s, a man the Rizzutos had absorbed into their structure rather than eliminating, giving him a chance to prove his loyalty to the new regime. He had risen through that structure, earned a measure of trust, and been groomed, according to organized crime writers, for potential leadership. He was the man who, in the famous Project Colisée footage, arrived at the Consenza Social Club carrying large wads of cash and handed a 2-inch thick stack of bills to Patriarch Niccolo Rizzuto, the cash that Rizzuto, then 82 years old, stuffed into his socks. When the Rizzuto family came under assault while Vito was imprisoned, Gallo made a choice. He aligned with the Montagna faction. He bet against Vito Rizzuto, against the family that had spared him when they could have eliminated him, against the Patriarch whose socks had contained his cash on camera in the Consenza. When Montagna was killed in November 2011 and the coup collapsed, Gallo's position became precarious instantly. He was deported to Italy in January 2012, then relocated to Acapulco, Mexico, believing or perhaps hoping that the distance would provide what the failed coup had not. In Acapulco, he became a regular at Forza Italia, an Italian restaurant along the coast. Same table, same time, same routine. The kind of pattern that, in the world he came from, he should have known better than to establish. The 10th of November, 2013. Sunday evening. Acapulco. Gallo was at his table at Forza Italia, dressed in white slacks and a pink shirt, dining with friends. A man dressed in black walked through the door, a 9mm pistol. Multiple shots fired into Gallo's head and back at point-blank range. He died before he hit the floor. The 10th of November, 2013. 3 years to the day from the murder of Niccolo Rizzuto, who had been shot through double-paned glass in his own home on the 10th of November 2010. This was not coincidence. In the Mafia, dates are chosen deliberately. The anniversary murder said something that no amount of verbal communication could have conveyed as clearly. The debt for Niccolo's death was being paid, on the same date, 3 years later. Across an international border, in a Mexican coastal city, in a restaurant where a man thought he was safe because he was 2,000 miles from Montreal, the message was the date itself. And the date said, "We remember everything, and the clock we keep is our own." The choice of November 10th for Gallo's murder in Acapulco is the most significant single detail in Vito Rizzuto's entire revenge campaign, and it deserves the specific attention that organized crime analysts have given it in the years since, because it is not simply the choice of an anniversary. It is the choice of a specific kind of communication, a message sent not through words, but through timing, requiring the recipient to understand both what was being communicated and what it meant about the sender. The 10th of November, 2010, Niccolo Rizzuto, 86 years old, is shot through the double-paned glass of his mansion in Cartierville by a single sniper's bullet. He dies in front of his wife. The patriarch of the Montreal Mafia is killed in his own home. The date is November 10th, the 10th of November, 2013. Moreno Gallo, the man who had betrayed the family that spared him and provided for him, is shot in the head in a restaurant in Acapulco on the 3rd anniversary of that patriarch's death. The same date, 3 years later, 2,000 miles away. In the Mafia's specific language of violence, timing is not incidental. A killing carried out on the anniversary of another killing is a statement that the two events are connected, that the debt created by the first has been paid by the second. On the symbolic date that makes that payment legible to everyone who needs to understand it, the anniversary murder says, "We remember the exact date your betrayal cost us, and on that exact date, 3 years later, we have settled the account." The operational complexity required to execute that timing is significant. Reaching Gallo in Acapulco required intelligence, knowing his location, his routine, the restaurant he frequented, the table he sat at. It required resources, the men to carry out the operation, and the logistical capacity to move them into position in a Mexican coastal city. It required coordination, the ability to execute the killing on a specific date, not approximately around it, not when opportunity arose, but on November 10th specifically. All of that operational infrastructure, assembled and deployed with the precision required to hit a target 2,000 miles from Montreal on the 3rd anniversary of his patron's murder, was itself a demonstration of organizational capacity. The Rizzuto organization could reach anywhere, and it could do so on schedule. Gallo died the way men die in Mafia movies, which is to say, the way men die in the Mafia, dressed for dinner, in public, without warning, quickly. He had been a regular at Forza Italia for at least a year. He had been lobbying the Canadian government for re-entry, hoping to return to Montreal, to his wife, to his bakery, to some version of the life that the deportation had taken from him. He was 2,000 miles from the city where his fate had been decided. None of it was enough. The man who died before he could finish, Vito Rizzuto, died on the 23rd of December, 2013, 43 days after the murder of Moreno Gallo in Acapulco. He was 67 years old. The official cause of death was complications from pneumonia, possibly induced by the lung cancer that had been advancing through his body during the entire period of his revenge campaign. He had been fighting the disease through every killing, every meeting in an armored car, every strategic conversation conducted out of reach of Canadian surveillance. He had conducted close to a dozen executions while cancer was consuming his lungs. He was taken to Sacré-Cœur Hospital in Montreal. No autopsy was performed on his body. That decision has generated speculation, documented and persistent, that his death was not entirely natural. Lung cancer and pneumonia are the official record. Whether those were the only forces at work has never been established one way or the other. The absence of an autopsy means that question has no definitive answer. And, in the world Vito had occupied his entire adult life, unanswered questions about causes of death are simply part of the landscape. He was buried on the 30th of December, 2013, at Saint-François d'Assise Cemetery in Saint-Léonard, following a funeral at the Church of the Madonna della Difesa in Montreal's Little Italy. Approximately 800 people attended. The number was itself a statement. Vito Rizzuto, for all the federal convictions and deportation hearings and organized crime designations, had been a figure of genuine stature in the community he came from, and the community turned out to acknowledge that. His enemies were not among the 800. Most of them were dead or in prison. Roger Valiquette Jr., a loan shark and Desjardins ally with ties to DeMaulo, had been gunned down, execution style, in a parking lot in Laval on the 18th of December, 2013, 5 days before Vito died. He was the last name crossed off the list while Vito was still alive. The revenge campaign that began with DeMaulo's murder in November 2012 and ran through Gallo's killing in November 2013 had reached, in the final weeks before Vito's death, the systematic elimination of every major figure in the coalition that had targeted his family. But the list was not finished. It was never finished. The organization continued after his death, carrying forward the campaign that Vito had set in motion. Carmine Verducci, shot to death outside a cafe in April 2014. Tonino Calocchia, killed by masked men in a bistro. In December 2014, he had survived a first attempt on his life in February 2013, before the second found him. The ongoing targeting of Desjardins allies and Calabrian opportunists who had made their calculations against the family and found those calculations fatally wrong continued for years after Vito's death, driven by the organizational logic that Vito had re-established during his 14 months of freedom. What the revenge meant. The standard analysis of what Vito Rizzuto accomplished between October 2012 and his death in December 2013 focuses on the number of people killed, the precision of the campaign, and the speed with which he reasserted organizational control. All of that is accurate. What the standard analysis sometimes misses is the deeper significance of what the campaign communicated. Mafia authority is not enforced primarily through violence. It is enforced through the credible threat of violence, through the general understanding that betrayal will be punished and that the punishment will reach you regardless of the precautions you take. The challenge that the Montagne Desjardins coup had posed to the Rizzuto family was not just operational. It was existential in the specific sense that matters to organized crime organizations. It was a challenge to the credibility of that threat. Men had concluded that the Rizzutos could be betrayed without consequence. That the family was finished, that Vito Rizzuto, sitting in a Colorado prison cell, could not reach them. What the revenge campaign demonstrated, killing by killing, date by date, was that those conclusions were wrong. A man could be reached in Sicily with 30 bullets and a fire. A man could be poisoned in a federal penitentiary cell. A man could be shot in an Acapulco restaurant on the specific anniversary of the patriarch's murder, in a message so precise that its meaning was unmistakable to anyone who understood the code. The former RCMP analyst Pierre de Champlain observed, in the years after Vito's death, that during Vito's era, everything had worked in Montreal's organized crime landscape because of his specific ability to hold competing interests in balance. Nobody has been able to bring together all the Mafia clans in Montreal, he said. The instability that followed Vito's death, the continued violence, the fracturing of the organization, the eventual Project Alliance prosecution that targeted the entire Rizzuto leadership decades later, was evidence of what he had provided and what his absence produced. For 59 days between his release from prison and his death, Vito Rizzuto ran a revenge campaign that reached from Montreal's suburbs to a restaurant in Sicily to an Italian restaurant in Acapulco. He did it while dying of lung cancer. He did it from an armored car, from a guarded apartment, from the specific position of a man who knew he was running out of time and was using every hour of what remained. Whether what he accomplished constituted victory depends on how you define it. The men who had killed his son and his father were dead or imprisoned. The man who had attempted to take his throne had been found floating in a river. The family's credibility had been reasserted through blood. But Vito himself was gone at 67 before he could see what the organization would become without him. And the organization, without him, did not hold together the way it had when he was at its center. The standard analysis of what Vito Rizzuto accomplished between October 2012 and his death in December 2013 focuses on the number of people killed, the precision of the campaign, and the speed with which he reasserted organizational control. All of that is accurate, and all of it matters. What the standard analysis sometimes misses is the deeper significance of what the campaign communicated, not to law enforcement, not to journalists, not to the public, but to the specific audience that a mafia boss's actions are always primarily directed at: the men inside the organization and the men in competing organizations who are constantly assessing where power actually resides. Mafia authority is not enforced primarily through violence. That is the misunderstanding that popular culture has always promoted, the idea that what makes a mafia boss powerful is his willingness to personally commit violence or to order large amounts of it. What makes a mafia boss powerful is the credible threat of violence, the general understanding among everyone in his world that betrayal will be punished and that the punishment will reach you regardless of the precautions you take, the distance you put between yourself and the organization, or the prison walls that separate you from the street. When that credibility is intact, violence is rarely necessary. When it is challenged, as it was during Vito's imprisonment, restoring it requires exactly the kind of systematic, public, precisely timed campaign that Vito conducted. Every killing in the campaign served the dual purpose of settling a specific debt and restoring a general principle. Joe DiMaolo's death in his own driveway said, "Even a respected figure with decades of relationships cannot protect himself from this organization's reach." The burning of Fernandez's body in Sicily said, "Geography does not protect you." The poisoning of De Vito in federal prison said, "Institutional barriers do not protect you." The murder of Gallo in Acapulco on November 10th said, "We will find you, we will choose our moment, and we will send a message that everyone who needs to understand will understand." By December 2013, when Vito Rizzuto died, the message had been delivered comprehensively enough that the organizational structure he had re-established was robust enough to continue without him, at least for a time. The killing of Roger Valiquette Jr. on December 18th, 5 days before Vito's death, was the last stroke of the campaign he personally oversaw. The killings that followed in 2014 and beyond were conducted by the men who remained and who understood what had been re-established during those 14 months. The former RCMP analyst, Pierre de Champlain, captured what Vito's specific combination of capabilities had provided when he observed, years after Vito's death, that during Vito's era, everything worked in Montreal's organized crime landscape because of him. The peace that the organization had maintained the ability to bring together the Mafia, the Hells Angels, the West End Gang, the South American cartels, all the competing interests that Montreal's geography and criminal economy attracted, depended on a specific kind of authority that Vito had spent 30 years building and that his successors proved unable to replicate. The instability that followed his death was not simply the absence of a powerful boss. It was the absence of the specific institutional intelligence that had made Montreal work at its most profitable and its least violent under Vito's management. There is something else worth naming about the revenge campaign that rarely appears in any analysis of it, because it requires acknowledging something uncomfortable about the man who conducted it. Vito Rizzuto did all of this knowing he was dying. The lung cancer that would kill him in December 2013 was not a late discovery. He had been aware of it before he left prison, or became aware of it very shortly after. He came home to a city that had tried to destroy his family, drove through it in an armored car, managed a cancer diagnosis alongside a campaign of organized executions, and never once in any intercepted call, any surveillance record, any piece of intelligence that Canadian law enforcement gathered about him during those 14 months gave any indication of slowing down or stepping back. That specific quality of his conduct, the refusal to let physical mortality interrupt what he understood as the moral obligation of his position, is what separates the Vito Rizzuto story from ordinary organized crime. Narrative. Most men, facing that combination of circumstances, would have made different choices. The pragmatic choice was exile. The peaceful choice was retirement. The self-preserving choice was to stay out of conflict entirely and spend whatever time remained with his family. Vito made none of those choices. He made the choice that the code he had lived by for 60 years demanded. He came home, he identified the men who owed debts, and he collected. Whether that makes him admirable in any conventional sense is not the question. The question is what it reveals about what the Mafia actually is, underneath the movies and the mythology. It is a system of obligation, of debts incurred and debts paid, of loyalty rewarded and betrayal punished, of a social order maintained through consequences that every member of that world understands from the day they enter it. Vito Rizzuto, dying of cancer, operating from an armored car, conducting executions across 3 countries, was not acting outside that system. He was fulfilling it, with complete precision, until 43 days before he died. He died having done what he came home to do. Not all of it, the list was never fully finished, and the violence continued after his death, but enough of it that the organization he had built survived the crisis that had threatened to end it permanently. The violence didn't end in December 2013. The family continued, the debts continued. In 2023, a woman named Claudia Iacono, married to Moreno Gallo's son, was shot 5 times outside her business in Montreal. The killers said it was a mistake. The real target was her husband. Gallo's son denies any ties to organized crime. It doesn't seem to matter. In that world, the name you carry is the debt you inherit. Vito Rizzuto died 43 days after his final confirmed hit. He left behind a list that wasn't finished, a family that continued his work, and a demonstration of what Mafia loyalty means when it is violated. Distance doesn't protect you. Time doesn't protect you. Prison walls don't protect you. And the date on the calendar, on the anniversary of your betrayal, is not a coincidence. Vito Rizzuto ran the most sophisticated criminal operation in Canadian history for 30 years, lost his son and father to betrayal, spent 6 years in an American prison, came home dying of lung cancer, and in 14 months of freedom conducted a purge that reached across 3 countries and settled accounts that the men who owed them had believed were safely beyond reach. He died at 67. The organization he left behind was weaker than the one he had built, but it was alive, which, in October 2012, had not seemed like a certainty. The men who had gambled that Vito Rizzuto would not come home, or that if he came home, he would accept what had been done, lost that gamble with their lives. The men who had stayed loyal survived and eventually inherited what was left. And the mice who had danced while the cat was away understood, by December 2013, exactly what that saying had been warning them about. In organized crime, nothing is forgotten and very little is forgiven. Distance doesn't help, time doesn't help. The date on the calendar, on the anniversary of the worst thing you did, is the date you should be afraid of. Vito Rizzuto made sure they knew that. The legacy that Vito Rizzuto left in Montreal's organized crime landscape is complicated in the specific way that legacies tend to be when the person who built something was also the only person capable of holding it together. His successors, his surviving son Leonardo, Rocco Solicito's son Stefano, the men who inherited the organizational structures he had rebuilt during his 14 months of freedom, proved unable to replicate the specific combination of intelligence, diplomatic skill, and credible authority that had made Vito's 30-year reign work. The violence that followed his death was not simply the continuation of the revenge campaign. It was also the beginning of the fragmentation that Pierre de Champlain had predicted when he observed that nobody had been able to bring together all the Mafia clans in Montreal after Vito was gone. The 2026 Project Alliance prosecution, the largest Mafia prosecution in Canadian history, charging nearly the entire Rizzuto leadership with murder, gangsterism, and money laundering, was built in significant part on the testimony of a former Rizzuto contract killer named Freddie Silva, who reportedly committed 65 murders for multiple criminal groups before making a deal with prosecutors in 2022. The organization that Vito had spent 30 years building and 14 dying months rebuilding had produced a witness who knew enough to potentially destroy it. Vito would have recognized that outcome. He had spent his entire career managing exactly the kind of loyalty that prevented it. Without him, the management failed. Subscribe and hit the bell. There are more stories like this one coming, and they don't end cleanly.